U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been in Beijing following the Trump meeting in Singapore. However, while the situation on the Korean Peninsula seems to be improving, the Trump administration's mixing of security and economic issues poses a challenge, and U.S.-China trade tensions continue to be problematic. Meanwhile, in China, the State Council plans to further cut tariffs on a number of imported goods starting on July the 1st. The decision was described as continuing the country's opening up to benefit domestic consumers and boost industrial transformation. To discuss all things related to the policy and politics of China-U.S. trade, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Jeffrey Towson from Peking University, and Mr. Timothy Stratford, Managing Partner of Covington & Burling LLP, Beijing, and former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Deng. So, gentlemen, U.S. President Donald Trump has just approved new tariff moves against China. What does he want this time, Professor?
Well, I think this follows on the trip Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, came to Beijing last time, and apparently there was a kind of a lengthy negotiation between the two sides, and he left without making a statement, while China made a statement, a unilateral statement, summarizing the achievements and the commitment China's going to make, but also ends with a statement that if the U.S. side keeps imposing tariffs, the earlier round in the amount of $50 billion, targeting $50 billion of American imports from China, all the negotiation results will be void in that statement. Apparently, I think from Donald Trump's perspective, he is not satisfied with the results, or he's still trying to use that as a negotiation tactic to achieve some further concessions from China. So I think this is the broader background. That's where we're coming from. That's why he is announcing this. And I think his position is probably more strengthened as a result of this summit in Singapore between U.S. and North Korea. The leverage probably China has against the U.S. position, China's very important role in the non-nuclearization issue in the Korean Peninsula is probably diminished a lot these days. So that's where he's coming from.
So, Mr. Stratford, do you think by doing this, the Trump administration has discredited its earlier pledge?
I think that part of the challenge in figuring this all out is that the U.S. government is actually doing separate things at the same time, and so it's easy for people to be confused. On the one hand, President Trump has spoken, including when he was a candidate, about the trade deficit between the U.S. and China. But an entirely different topic is whether China has certain economic policies that are viewed by the United States as harmful to its own economy. That's a completely separate topic. And on the one hand, you have the United States Trade Representative's Office, where I used to work, which published a report last March under Section 301 of the U.S. trade law that concluded that China has certain policies that distort the way innovation and technology is handled. And then on the other hand, you have President Trump, who has for a long time talked about the trade deficit. The tariffs are part of the 301 report. They're part of the question of dealing with technology innovation. So they're really completely separate. And the challenge is that so far the two governments have not really made a lot of progress in addressing the U.S. government's concern in the 301 report. And that's the reason that the United States looks like they're about to impose these tariffs, not because of the trade deficit.
What do you make of the ripple effects of this on-again, off-again tactic, if you put it that way, of Donald Trump, Professor?
Right. In China now, we are all businessmen, I think government as well. We are all playing the new national pastime of the U.S., which is, what does Donald Trump want? And you're never totally sure. He announces things, he will take some actions, but then it can change very quickly.
Maybe he wants unpredictability.
there's a level of unpredictability, and we're all speculating. And I don't think it's just here in China, especially business people. We're speculating what's going to happen, what does he want. I think it's happening in the U.S. I think it's happening in a lot of places. And as mentioned, there look like there are at least 2 or 3 issues here at the same time, which I would characterize as votes, tech, and trade. Yes, this seems to be about the trade deficit, because he spoke about this at length throughout the whole campaign. But it certainly seems to be a lot about technology and what's going to be happening 5, 10 years from now. And then the third would be votes, that he was elected to some degree by speaking to manufacturing jobs in the U.S., so it could be about what influences those people the most or impacts them the most. But it looks like there's a couple issues here. It's unclear.
Mr. Stratford, looking at China-U.S. trade, especially the U.S. trade deficit to China, what do you think is the main causes of this problem?
Well, the main causes of the U.S. deficit globally are macroeconomic causes related to fiscal deficits and savings rates and all of these types of issues. And normally economists don't focus so much on bilateral trade deficits, because you have to look at trade between a lot of countries and how it sort of adds up together. I think that the trade deficit with China is particularly large, much larger than with other countries, and I think that that may be a reflection of some of the underlying trade policies that the U.S. Trade Representative's Office is concerned about. But trade imbalances in of themselves have a lot of different causes, and I think the trade professionals and the economists would say that if you only focus on that one problem on a bilateral basis, you won't actually be able to solve it. You have to look at deeper issues.
Professor Gong, do you think this is also a structural problem? Because it's reported that U.S. also has huge surplus in trade to China in service sector.
Yeah, well, one of the things that already Tim has mentioned is because of structural issues, because of U.S., the so-called twin deficit problem. I think this has a lot to do with the intertwining nature between these two large economies. I mean, look at the Chinese exports to America. Over 40% of it is actually associated with corporate America. Look at the top list of exporters to the U.S. They are either corporate America themselves or OEMs, Chinese OEMs working for corporate America. And Foxcom's phones is a very big item in Chinese exports to the U.S. So, this is a lot to do with over the last 30-some years that corporate America has made huge investment, foreign direct investment in China, and China has definitely benefited a lot from that since China's joined WTO. So these are the sort of a historical trend that's not likely to change very soon. I think, and also if you look at talking about unemployment, I mean this time of the in history, U.S. is seeing the lowest unemployment ever. It's almost less than 4%, so it's almost like full employment. So I think I totally agree with Tim. The issue is not so much about trade deficit. It's really about America's very strong concern about the quick and very rapid ascendance of corporate China's innovation capabilities and its technological prowess. And these things that the U.S. think that are attributed to Chinese government's so-called distortionary trade practices. But I don't quite know, I don't quite agree that the route they're pursuing, the route they're pursuing with respect to Chinese government's industrial policy has a lot to do with Chinese companies' innovation capabilities.
Do you agree with Professor Gong, Mr. Stratford?
Certainly there are a number of Chinese companies who are very innovative, and they would be innovative under whatever conditions. But there are a number of Chinese policies that sort of change the rules. It's kind of like Americans going onto the playing field ready for European soccer, and the Chinese going onto the same playing field ready for American soccer, where they have all the heavy pads on and the helmets. And those are two different games, and if you're playing on the same field, one side's going to get hurt because the other is playing a different game. It's kind of like this. Suppose you're an American company and you're planning to build a $3 billion plant, and you're deciding where to build it. If you build it in China, you may get some subsidies from the government to build it. and you know that you'll have access to sell your product throughout the Chinese market, which is a very large market, and you can also sell it in the U.S. market because the U.S. market is quite open. But if you build the same plant in the United States, you can sell it in the U.S. market, but there may be various barriers that allow you to not penetrate the Chinese market so well. And therefore, if you're deciding where to build your plant, you say, well, I should build it in China instead of the U.S. because I'll be able to have two markets instead of one. And if you're trying to decide where to build a plant based on government policies and not based on pure economic principles, that's the kind of thing that the U.S. government would be concerned about.
So talking about the rules of the game, do you think the Trump administration is going to totally put the WTO rules aside?
In January of this year, USTR published their annual report on China's compliance with WTO rules. And in that report, they made two very remarkable statements. The first one was they concluded that it was a mistake for the United States to support China's entry into the WTO on the terms that were agreed at the time. I think that's a very strong and stunning statement, and I don't think everyone agrees with that. But that's one statement. And the second statement is that the WTO rules in and of themselves and the WTO disciplines are not enough to deal with the challenges that China's different economic model presents. And so I think based on that, the Trump administration is willing to take some unilateral action, and that's what we're seeing in the 301 report.
I just want to address the WTO issues Tim raised. I think the statement that the assessment that letting China join WTO is a wrong move back 17 years ago. I think this is more of a geopolitical statement. Certainly I think the world benefits a lot from China being more economically prosperous and join the world economic system. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The world was much of a better China today than a China that's perpetually locked in poverty and revolutionary things. On the other hand, I think the issue about the WTO in addressing the contentious issues between U.S. and China, I agree that WTO is a multilateral system. Things are quite slow and difficult to move to advance some of the concerns, agendas that U.S. government has. I think U.S. government should view WTO as more of a complement to the other things that U.S. government has unilaterally trying to deal with China. I think what he is doing right now is to make WTO when it's advantageous to the U.S. government, but sort of dispenses away from it when it's not in its interest. But I think there's a real danger. There's a real danger that he's going to pull out of it altogether.
Do you think the danger is real, Mr. Stratford?
I think it's very unlikely that the U.S. will pull out of the WTO, but I do think that the Trump administration is quite unhappy with some aspects of the WTO, and I think that they may be trying to express their displeasure and hope people will take seriously the idea that the members of the WTO should look at some of the challenges and the problems and address them seriously. So I think it may be sort of setting things up for a negotiation. If you look at the 301 report again, after the report outlined its complaints about the Chinese system, it said, so the U.S. will impose tariffs, will impose investment restrictions, and we will bring a WTO case. Now, if you look at the WTO case, that shows that the U.S. is still willing to use the WTO. But it's a very, very narrow technical issue that the U.S. is bringing to the WTO. And the judgment apparently is that the other issues could not be adequately addressed by the WTO framework, and therefore it's necessary for the U.S. to take.
I'm not a trade expert. Just allow me asking, when you have a multilateral mechanism like the World Trade Organization, where you can talk about trade disputes, then why the United States needs to punish other countries with domestic law?
Well, there are two types of domestic law. Some domestic laws are particularly allowed in the WTO. For example, as long as you follow certain proper procedures and standards, countries are allowed to bring anti-dumping cases against imports. And they're also allowed to have safeguard cases if their local industry is injured for a temporary period of time. There's also something called countervailing duties if you can show that a foreign government is subsidizing products. So these things are all allowed by the WTO. But the United States is also taking some other actions that are not necessarily allowed by the WTO. And in doing that, that's one of the reasons that other countries are complaining.
What about the U.S. trade moves against Canada, citing a Cold War law and national security against its biggest neighbor?
Yeah, I think that the tariff on steel and aluminum is a prime example. It's a prime example of how the U.S. totally ignores WTO rules. The Section 232 action, which is based on the national security argument, is just doesn't make sense according to, is that Article 21 at the GATT? I think so, yeah, that's Article 21 at GATT. And this argument about national security, steel being a national security a concern, especially steel imports from Canada, which is probably the closest ally of the U.S. government, is just preposterous in my opinion. In the WTO history, there was one time a case involving, I think it's the Swedish government, making an argument that shoes could be an issue for national security. So, and it was laughed at. Eventually, the Swiss government pulled away from that. So I think this argument based on national security for Section 232 it doesn't make sense to me. It's a prime example of ignoring the WTO rule.
Yes. If I can just add a gloss on that, WTO rules do allow countries to make judgments about their own national security, and no country can say surrender their right to make judgments about their national security.
So do you think Canada is a threat to U.S. national security?
The challenge is that since countries ultimately are their own, make their own decisions about national security, traditionally in the WTO, countries have tried very hard to have very narrow definitions of national security. Because if you can cite national security on any type of thing, then pretty soon the rules don't have any meaning anymore, because you can make an exception to anything. And so I think the idea that automobile imports from Canada would threaten national security in the U.S., I think that's a very aggressive position to take, and it may make it harder for the United States to complain about other countries who may invoke national security for things that the U.S. thinks are inappropriate.
Thank you very much. We'll be continuing this right after this short break. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. So, Professor Gong, you're about to say something to Mr. Stratford's remarks.
Well, I was just about to say, this steel and aluminum tariff, I think, is a very clear abuse of the Article 21 in the GATT. It's an argument that doesn't make sense to me at all.
Right, so let's talk about China's own opening up, because very soon, on July the 1st, China is going to reduce significantly tariffs on many imported goods. What's the point of this move?
Well, I think on one side, China is continuing on its open door policy path. We are going to do these things anyway, regardless of what's going to happen with the U.S. trade spread. But on the other hand, I think there's a certain element in the government strategy to use these open-ups as sort of a bargaining position in dealing with the U.S. government. So I think it's sort of a combination of both sides that's sort of pushing this. But I think overall, I think our government is very clear about reducing tariffs on a lot of things, and also opening up several markets, and also about getting rid of a lot of the things that U.S. government has been complaining about. For example, the equity restriction in the automobile industry is already gone now. For the the alternative energy cost, Tesla is going to establish a wholly owned company in Shanghai, I believe. And this practice is going to, I think, is going to extend to combustion engine costs as well in the future. So gradually we are opening up these things. I think it's really a matter of how as opposed to if. It's China always, this is actually very much of a Chinese characteristic. We always do things sort of in an evolutionary approach. We do things in a phased approach, right? So I think it's going to take some time, hopefully not very long, that eventually that we're going to be more and more open, very much like the U.S. market. It may take maybe 10 years, hopefully. China being the largest trading nation in the world, having the largest exports and imports, already the largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity calculation, cannot sustain by keeping the status quo. We have to be an open market. We can't just export to prosperity. We have to also import as well. And to some extent, I think our government is in full agreement with this. We're going to have a very big exhibition, the world's probably only exports exhibition in the world, coming in
the
November.
Shanghai Import Expo. That's
Shanghai
the first
Imports
in China and maybe the first in world trade history.
That's what I think. Very few Minister of Commerce is so fixated on increasing imports like our minister is. So this is a major movement, and I think it's the country is generally moving in that direction.
Right, Mr. Stratford, what do you make of China's massive campaign to increase import?
Well, of course, it's a very positive thing that China would do this. The criticism that you would get from the U.S. government and also from most of the business community from the United States is that China is opening up in areas, in selective areas, where either they're not related to the high technology sectors that China is trying to develop under Made in China 2025, or they're areas where China already is far beyond being a developing country. If you take autos, for example, China makes more cars than any other country in the world, and the idea that they still need protectionist tariffs is really outdated. So either it's sectors where China's industry is already well developed, or it tends to be sectors that don't impinge on China's industrial policy goals. So the business community from the United States and the U.S. government are not really satisfied that this is really addressing the fundamental problems that they're concerned about.
Do you think that's true, Professor Towson?
Yeah, I think that's about right. It's at a deal level. I mean, this is interesting because it's a trade talk, but on another level, you can look at this as just a deal, a negotiation. And Trump is a deal guy at the end of the day, and that has a lot to do with putting options on the table. Right. The last thing you want is a standoff. I want 10, you want 20. We lock horns and just see who's stronger. Now, you put options on the table. You put options on the table. You try and keep doing that and find another solution. So lowering tariffs, opening markets. With regard to that, that's a way of putting more options on the table that we can work out things. Maybe we disagree here, we'll work something out here. So I think that looks a lot to me that is what's going on. More broadly, yes, I think you're seeing a general opening, but it appears to be pretty selective. And I think
but Professor Gong just mentioned that China would like to take things step by step, not once for all.
Yeah, I think there's a balance of interest. What I think is interesting is China has an industrial policy. We can see clearly what the objectives of the country are. And generally, policies and tariffs and things follow that to a large degree. So if there's a new industry that's just opening up, it might be more protected, or there might be more technology interest in that, but others that are more developed, you could see them opening them up. I think it's part of the same process. I just think it's a later stage in what we've seen for the last 15 years.
Do you agree, Professor?
China has an industrial policy, that's for sure. But I think to some extent, the United States also has one too. For example, the agricultural sector is heavily subsidized by the U.S. government, according to the U.S. Farm Bill. There's many other examples. The semiconductor industry, for example, the U.S. government used to, at one time, pour lots of money and set up a joint venture, to fund a joint venture in Austin, Texas. As I remember, I was still a student back then in University of Texas, Austin. The massive funding, for example, from the National Institute of Health, for example, the DARPA program, that's the defense-related technologies, and mostly about basic research, and several very famous laboratories under the national laboratories and the Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, grants. In a way, I think what China differs from the U.S. probably maybe in scale, but not in substance. Both countries have their fair share of industrial policies.
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Well,
no, I don't think that's...
So what's your take?
No, I'm sorry to interrupt on this. No, I think the U.S. does not have at least a broad industrial policy. It doesn't have a top-down developed industrial policy. A lot of stuff happens. There are loans, there are subsidies, there are tax breaks, various things. There are no state-owned enterprises. There are no subsidized loans, generally speaking. Most of this, if you look at where the tech comes from, where the industries have developed, it has been overwhelmingly organic.
There are subsidized loans for farmers, for sure.
Yeah. Overwhelmingly organic.
So you're saying that there are no national strategic guidance, no national strategy in terms of the U.S. Industrial sector?
I think there is some in the U.S., but I think if you look at how much there is in China and how much there is in the U.S., it becomes qualitatively different because of the vastly different scale of what's going on. Here's what I think is what's happening. I think the U.S. will impose these tariffs, and I think they may impose some investment restrictions as well. China may well retaliate, as they've said they had. The U.S. will demonstrate that it can inflict harm on the Chinese economy and on some companies. China will demonstrate that it can inflict harm on American companies. And so it's like we're entering into a dark tunnel, and we're both going to...
Is there a way out?
That's my question, because imposing the tariffs in and of themselves by either side doesn't actually solve the underlying problems. Basically what it does is each side is getting the attention of the other side and saying, look, we need to have a serious talk. And so what we really need to focus on is, what does the light look like at the end of the tunnel? What sort of accommodation will allow our two economies to work in a way so that we don't have one side dressed in American football gear and the other side dressed in soccer gear? And those are discussions that the two governments are really not having yet in a serious way. China has said that Made in China 2025 is not on the table because this is our national interest to do this. I understand that. But the U.S. has also pointed out ways that China's approach is harming the U.S. economy. So these two governments have to sit down and work this out, and it will be a challenge. And so I agree with Jeff that this is going to take some time to work out.
What do you think is the way out here, Professor Towson?
This may just be a process. There may not, I mean, maybe it's not the end of a tunnel. Maybe this is just the nature of the engagement. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs competed their whole lives. Very different people, very different strategies. In many areas they were partners, in others they were their toughest competitors.
Right.
And that was the nature of the relationship. At the end of his life, I think they really respected each other. I don't think China is going to change its system. I think it's been incredibly successful. I brought some students out to Omaha a couple months ago and we sat down with Warren Buffett, and he basically said the same thing. The phrase he used was, China has developed a secret sauce. That was his term, secret sauce, that has been incredibly successful by any measure.
So, Professor Gong, do you think bridging differences is the way out?
I actually agree with Tim that we're going to see a period of very intense confrontation between these two countries. This is probably maybe just the nature of Donald Trump's style of negotiation. That's the bad news. But the good news is that these tariffs can be get rid of any time of the day. So, I mean, look at America's historic record. There are several times that the United States president imposed these tariffs, but it didn't last very long, 2 or 3 years, and it'll be gone. So I think we may enter into this period of confrontation on the trade side, but at the end of the day, I don't think these things will be lasting perpetually. I think, after a period of sort of confrontation, both sides will realize that it will be in both interests to come to the negotiating table to sort things out, to address the things that the other side is concerned about. So that's the good news. Hopefully we're going down that path.
Hopefully. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.